Hey, traveler. Tonight, I thought we'd talk about Edwardian England. Where are you in the world right now, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. What would you do if your entire day was dictated by your social standing? In Edwardian England, this was the reality for everyone, from the king to the chimney sweep. Let's gently peel back the layers of this society, a world away, yet surprisingly familiar in its human dramas. The Edwardian era, spanning roughly from 1901 to 1910, was a period of stark contrasts. At the apex stood the aristocracy, families with inherited wealth and titles, living in sprawling country estates like Downton Abbey, if Downton Abbey had a slightly less competent kitchen staff, that is. Picture them, leisurely breakfasts, afternoons spent riding or hunting, evenings filled with lavish dinners and dances. Their lives were a whirlwind of social engagements, their days carefully orchestrated by a legion of servants. But what good is unimaginable wealth if you're not showing it off? These families weren't just rich, they were custodians of tradition, expected to uphold a certain standard of living, even if it meant slowly eroding their fortunes. Think of it as the original Keeping Up with the Joneses, only the Joneses owned half a county. Now that we've gazed at the gilded lives of the aristocracy, let's descend a few rungs on the social ladder to the middle class. If you've ever felt squeezed between wanting a better life and actually affording it, you'd understand the Edwardian middle class. This burgeoning group, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, consisted of professionals, businessmen, and skilled workers. They enjoyed a level of comfort and convenience unimaginable to the working class, but they were also acutely aware of their precarious position, constantly striving to climb higher, or at least not fall lower. Speaking of aspirations, the Edwardian middle class was obsessed with upward mobility, and their homes reflected this ambition. A well-furnished parlor, complete with a piano, was a must-have. It was all about appearances, projecting an image of respectability and success. Think of it as the Edwardian version of Instagram, except instead of carefully curated photos, it was meticulously arranged furniture and carefully chosen outfits. But what about the backbone of Edwardian society, the working class? If you've ever worked a double shift, imagine doing that 6 days a week with no overtime pay. Life for the working class was a constant struggle for survival. They toiled in factories, mines, and fields, their days filled with back-breaking labor and their nights offering little respite. Their homes were often cramped and unsanitary, their diets meager, and their futures uncertain. It was a life of relentless hardship, a stark contrast to the opulence enjoyed by the upper classes. Picture this situation. A family of 6 crammed into a single room in a London slum, struggling to make ends meet. The father works long hours in a factory, the mother takes in laundry, and the children scavenge for scraps of food. It's a bleak picture, but it was the reality for a large segment of the Edwardian population. It's a reminder that while we romanticize the era with images of grand estates and elegant gowns, there was a darker side to the Edwardian era, a side that's less Downton Abbey and more Dickensian novel. From the grandest manor house to the most humble cottage, Edwardian society was a rigid hierarchy, a complex tapestry woven with threads of privilege and poverty. Understanding these social strata is key to understanding the daily lives of Edwardian families.
It was a world where your birth determined your destiny, where opportunity was limited by your social standing, and where the gap between the rich and the poor seemed insurmountable. Key takeaway: Edwardian society was a world of stark contrasts where social standing dictated every aspect of life. But what good is class structure without daily routines? Let's look at how the average day might play out for members of these different social groups. If you've ever slept in past noon on a weekend, imagine the scandal if an Edwardian aristocrat did the same. Their day began early, not by choice, but by necessity. Servants would rouse them, prepare their elaborate breakfasts, and lay out their clothes for the day. After breakfast, they might attend to estate matters, engage in social calls, or pursue leisurely activities like riding, hunting, or gardening. The afternoons were reserved for social gatherings, such as tea parties or garden parties, where they could gossip and network. Evenings were the highlight of the day, with lavish dinners followed by dancing or card games. What would you do if every aspect of your life was managed by someone else? The aristocracy lived a life of pampered luxury, their every need catered to by a small army of servants. It's like having your own personal assistant, except instead of just scheduling your meetings, they're also polishing your silverware and arranging your flowers. Now that we've considered the life of leisure, let's examine the more structured existence of the middle class. Picture this situation: a middle-class businessman rushing to catch the train to London, his briefcase in hand. His day was filled with meetings, negotiations, and paperwork. His wife, meanwhile, managed the household, oversaw the servants, and raised the children. The evenings were spent together as a family, perhaps reading or playing games. It was a life of hard work and responsibility, but it offered a sense of stability and security. If you've ever felt the pressure to provide for your family, you can relate to the Edwardian middle class. They were the backbone of the economy, the engine of progress. They were like the Harry Potters of their day, constantly striving to improve their lot in life, even if it meant facing challenges and obstacles. Now that we've peeked into the world of the middle class, let's descend into the trenches, to the arduous lives of the working class. What would you do if your day began before dawn and ended long after sunset? The working class toiled in factories, mines, and fields, their days filled with back-breaking labor. They had little time for leisure or relaxation, their lives consumed by the struggle for survival. Evenings were spent tending to their families, preparing meager meals, and trying to get some rest before the next day's grind. Speaking of harsh conditions, the working class faced unimaginable hardships. They endured long hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions. It's a reminder that progress comes at a cost, and the Edwardian era was no exception. The working class paid the price for the prosperity of the upper classes. Key takeaway: daily life in Edwardian England varied dramatically depending on social class, from leisurely luxury to backbreaking labor.
The soft glow of a bedside lamp, perhaps, is your companion now, as we turn back the clock to a time of rigid routines and societal expectations, the Edwardian era. If you've ever felt the weight of a demanding schedule, imagine a world where your day was dictated not just by work, but by a complex choreography of social class, family duty, and unwavering tradition. Picture this situation. The sun, a pale orb behind London's perpetual fog, barely illuminates the cobblestone streets as the first stirrings of life begin. What would a typical day really entail? Well, that depended entirely on where you stood on the social ladder. For the wealthy, the Edwardian era was the twilight of an empire, a gilded cage of elaborate breakfasts, endless social calls, and the constant pressure to maintain appearances. For the working class, it was a struggle for survival, a relentless cycle of labor, poverty, and the ever-present threat of illness. Think Downton Abbey meets the ragged-trousered philanthropists. Let's peek into the lives of the privileged. The day began late, often around 9 a.m., with a light breakfast in bed, perhaps some toast, a boiled egg, and, of course, tea. This was followed by a more substantial breakfast downstairs, a veritable feast of kedgeree, bacon, sausages, and various pastries. The ladies of the house would then retire to their boudoirs to dress for the day, a process that could take hours, involving layers of elaborate clothing, intricate hairstyles, and the meticulous application of makeup. Forget effortless chic. Edwardian elegance demanded serious effort. Now that we've seen their breakfast, let's see how they handled leisure. Key takeaway: for the Edwardian elite, daily life was a performance, a constant display of wealth and social status. Speaking of appearances, this brings us to the intricate dance of social calls. The afternoon was devoted to visiting friends and acquaintances, exchanging pleasantries and cementing social connections. These calls were governed by strict etiquette, with specific times and days considered appropriate for each type of visit. Imagine having to consult a social calendar just to figure out when you could drop by for a chat. If you've ever felt awkward making small talk at a party, be grateful you weren't navigating the minefield of Edwardian social customs. The evening was reserved for dinner parties, theater visits, or musical evenings. These events were opportunities to showcase one's wealth and sophistication, with elaborate meals, dazzling gowns, and witty conversation. But beneath the surface of gaiety, there lurked a constant anxiety about social standing and reputation. Remember, one wrong word or gesture could ruin a family's prospects. Now that we've looked into how the wealthy spent their days, let's look at how they spent their evenings. Key takeaway: Edwardian social life was a carefully constructed performance where every detail mattered. But what about those who weren't born into privilege? For the working class, life was a stark contrast to the opulent world of the elite. The day began before dawn, with families crammed into small, unsanitary dwellings. Men often worked in factories, mines, or shipyards, enduring long hours and dangerous conditions for meager wages. Women often worked as domestic servants, laundresses, or seamstresses, facing similar hardships. Imagine working 12 hours a day in a textile mill and then coming home to a house with no running water. Meals were simple and sparse, often consisting of bread, potatoes, and perhaps a bit of meat if the family could afford it. Children were often sent to work at a young age, contributing to the family income. Education was a luxury that few could afford. If you've ever complained about your job, take a moment to appreciate the opportunities you have that were unimaginable for the Edwardian working class. And don't even get me started on childcare. It was a free-for-all. What would you do if you had to choose between your children's education and their food? Key takeaway. For the Edwardian working class, survival was a daily struggle, with little time for leisure or personal fulfillment. From work to home, Edwardian families dealt with different scenarios than we do now. Speaking of hardships, this brings us to the ever-present threat of illness and disease. Medical care was expensive and often ineffective, and diseases like tuberculosis and typhoid were rampant. Poor sanitation and overcrowding contributed to the spread of illness, particularly in working-class neighborhoods. Imagine living in a world where a simple infection could be life-threatening. It's a stark reminder of how far we've come in terms of public health and medical advancements. Sure, we have to worry about things like gluten intolerance now, but at least we don't have to fear cholera outbreaks. Key takeaway. The Edwardian era was a time of great social inequality, with vast differences in wealth, opportunity, and access to health care. Leisure time was scarce for the working class, but they found ways to relax and escape the drudgery of daily life. Pubs were popular gathering places, offering a respite from the stresses of work and a chance to socialize with friends. Music halls provided entertainment, with popular songs, comedy acts, and variety shows. Think of it as their version of Netflix, only with more singing and less binge-watching. But what good is leisure without a little bit of community? Community was vital in Edwardian society. Speaking of community, this brings us to the importance of family and neighbors. People relied on each other for support, sharing resources and offering assistance in times of need. Friendly societies and trade unions provided a safety net for workers, offering benefits in case of illness, injury, or unemployment. Imagine relying on your neighbors to help you get through a tough time. It's a reminder of the power of human connection. Sure, we have social media now, but nothing beats a good old-fashioned cup of tea with a friend. Key takeaway. Despite the hardships of daily life, Edwardian communities were often tight-knit and supportive. The Edwardian era was a time of stark contrasts, a world of immense wealth and abject poverty. Understanding the daily lives of Edwardian families, both rich and poor, provides valuable insights into the social, economic, and cultural forces that shaped the era. From the elaborate rituals of the wealthy to the relentless labor of the working class, each day was a reflection of the prevailing social order. This era may be over, but it lives on in popular culture and historical research. But what does that mean for us today? Let's zoom out and understand these events. From rituals of routine to cultural reflections, Edwardian life required resilience.
The crackling fire casts long shadows, doesn't it? A fitting ambiance to ponder the lives of those who came before us, especially the tender years of Edwardian children. If you've ever felt the weight of expectation, imagine its intensified form in a society defined by rigid class structures and unwavering traditions. What was it really like to grow up in that era? Raising children during the Edwardian period was far from a uniform experience. It was a tapestry woven with threads of privilege, poverty, and everything in between. For the upper classes, childhood was often a carefully orchestrated affair, a training ground for future roles of leadership and social prominence. Think of it like a meticulously planned video game tutorial. Only instead of slaying dragons, they were expected to manage a state and navigate the intricacies of high society. These children were often raised by nannies and governesses, their parents figures seen more at formal occasions than during playtime. Education was paramount, but it wasn't about exploring passions or fostering creativity in the way we might encourage today. Instead, it was focused on mastering the classics, foreign languages, and the social graces, skills deemed essential for maintaining their family's status. History, literature, and perhaps some deportment lessons were the order of the day. If you were a boy, an elite boarding school like Eton or Harrow beckoned, promising a network of lifelong connections and a pathway to positions of power. But what good is all that education without the proper manners? Imagine the horror if young Master Cecil showed up to a dinner party and started eating peas with a knife. For girls, the expectations were different, yet equally demanding. While a formal education might be pursued, it was often considered secondary to developing skills that would make them desirable wives and capable homemakers. Think needlepoint, music, and the art of conversation, essential tools for navigating the marriage market and managing a household. But where boys were prepared for war and politics, girls were groomed for society and potential future wives. Key takeaway? Edwardian upper-class childhood was a gilded cage, offering comfort and opportunity, but also demanding conformity to rigid social expectations. Now that we've glimpsed the lives of privileged children, let's turn our attention to the other end of the spectrum, the working class. Here, childhood was a far cry from the idyllic scenes painted in drawing rooms. Instead, it was often a harsh and demanding reality, where children were expected to contribute to the family income from a very young age. It's quite hard to think about, in comparison to modern times, children in such situations. What if one of the little ones broke out into song à la Les Misérables? Imagine yourself as a child, barely old enough to read or write, heading off to work in a factory, a mine, or as a street vendor. Long hours, dangerous conditions, and meager wages were the norm. Education was a luxury few could afford. Survival was the priority. The 1901 Factory Act raised the minimum working age to 12. It wasn't always enforced. These children faced challenges that are almost unimaginable today.
Malnutrition, disease, and exploitation were rampant. They missed out on the simple joys of childhood, the games and carefree moments that we often take for granted. But what good is a childhood without any joy? We may not be able to change the past, but we can acknowledge the struggles and hardships faced by these young souls. From the very beginning, these children were workers, their childhood stolen by a society that valued profit over their well-being. Key takeaway: for working-class children, the Edwardian era was a time of hardship and sacrifice, where survival often meant sacrificing childhood itself. Speaking of harsh realities, let's consider the expectations placed on children in terms of their future careers. For the upper classes, career paths were often predetermined by family tradition and social standing. Sons were expected to follow in their father's footsteps, whether it was joining the military, entering politics, or managing the family estate. It was like a family business that could not be broken. Imagine the pressure of carrying on a legacy, knowing that your choices would not only affect your own life, but also the reputation of your family. Daughters, on the other hand, were primarily expected to marry well, securing their family's social standing and forging advantageous alliances. If you've ever felt like your career path was chosen for you, imagine having virtually no say in the matter. For working-class children, the options were even more limited. They typically followed their parents into manual labor, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and hardship. But here's the thing. Despite the bleak circumstances, many of these children possessed incredible resilience and a determination to make a better life for themselves. They found ways to learn, to create, and to dream, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. It was their only way of trying to find a light at the end of the tunnel. Key takeaway: Edwardian children faced vastly different expectations when it came to their future careers, depending on their social class. But what good is a bright future if you're stuck with a terrible education? Education during the Edwardian era was, unsurprisingly, highly stratified. Upper-class children received a rigorous education from private tutors and elite boarding schools, preparing them for positions of leadership and influence. They learned Latin, Greek, and other classical subjects, often memorizing vast amounts of information. It's like they were training to be human encyclopedias, ready to impress at dinner parties and debates. Working-class children, however, often received little or no formal education. Schools were often overcrowded and understaffed, and many children were forced to leave school at a young age to work. But here's the thing. Education wasn't just about academics. It was also about instilling values, shaping character, and preparing children for their roles in society. You might see this in the movies. When they are in school, they are being beaten rather than helped. This difference in educational opportunities reflected the vast inequalities of Edwardian society. Key takeaway: education was a privilege enjoyed by the upper classes, while working-class children often lacked access to even the most basic schooling. Speaking of social standing, let's consider the role that gender played in shaping the lives of Edwardian children. Boys and girls were raised with vastly different expectations and opportunities. Boys were encouraged to be strong, independent, and assertive, while girls were taught to be docile, obedient, and submissive.
But imagine how boring life was if you were forced to act in a certain way and not be able to be your true self. Girls were often discouraged from pursuing careers or intellectual pursuits, instead focusing on developing skills that would make them attractive marriage partners. They were taught to sew, to cook, and to manage a household, preparing them for their future roles as wives and mothers. Boys, on the other hand, were given more freedom to explore their interests and develop their talents. The difference in treatment based on gender reflected the prevailing social norms of the time. Women were seen as inferior to men, and their roles in society were strictly limited. But what good is equality if only half the population enjoys it? Edwardian society was deeply entrenched in patriarchal values, perpetuating inequalities that limited the opportunities and potential of girls. Key takeaway: gender played a significant role in shaping the lives of Edwardian children, with girls facing limitations and expectations that boys did not. So, picture this. You're an Edwardian child, navigating a world defined by rigid class structures and gender roles. Your future is largely predetermined by your social standing and your sex. You might be pampered and privileged, or you might be struggling to survive. You might be encouraged to pursue your dreams, or you might be forced to conform to societal expectations. What would you do? The Edwardian era was a time of great contrasts, a period of both progress and inequality. Understanding the lives of Edwardian children allows us to better appreciate the challenges they faced and the resilience they demonstrated. And maybe, just maybe, it can also help us to create a more just and equitable world for the children of today. Think about it like this. We've been looking through a telescope into the past and seen all the stars, their glory and their darkness. Hopefully, it helps us appreciate the dawn of a new day.
The embers of the Edwardian era glow faintly in our memories, don't they? A time often painted with elegance and grand estates, but what fueled this engine of empire? The daily grind, of course. What would you do if your worth was measured not in likes, but in labor? The Edwardian economy was a complex beast, a symphony of toil played out in factories, fields, and fancy drawing rooms. Now that we've covered what was on the surface, let's dive into the trenches. Factory work, the grim heart of industrial Britain, pulsed with the rhythm of machines. Imagine endless rows of looms clattering, the air thick with cotton dust. Ever wonder where the fabrics for those fabulous fashions came from? It wasn't all tea parties, you know. But medieval preservation wasn't about flavor. It was about not dying. It was about survival and progress, or just a meager wage. Speaking of meager wages, domestic service was another cornerstone. But what good is having servants if they all quit? The bells jingled in grand houses, summoning maids, cooks, and footmen. Think of Downton Abbey, but with less drama and more scrubbing. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by chores, consider a scullery maid's daily grind. The difference was their wages were next to nothing. Key takeaway: Edwardian progress relied on undervalued human toil. It wasn't perfect, but they thought it was progress. But picture this: a world where you measure the light by the length of a candle. Now that we've covered those who fueled the empire from below, let's talk about those who steered it from above.
professional careers for the privileged few offered a different kind of work. Imagine the endless paperwork. If you've ever worked in an office, you'll appreciate the Edwardian clerk's dedication to quill and ink. But what good is a quill without paper? Sure, it wasn't a spreadsheet, but it got the job done. Key takeaway? The Edwardian middle class embraced professional work as a path to respectability. From grand estates to factory floors, the Edwardian era presented a stark contrast in work experiences. Long before remote work existed, land ownership was the ultimate symbol of wealth and power. Remember, ownership in that era created a new type of job. If you've ever dreamed of owning your own property, you'll understand the Edwardian landowner's pride. Key takeaway? Land ownership represented not just wealth, but social standing and political influence. The Edwardian period was also a time of immense change, particularly for women. Long before gender equality became a mainstream concept, women fought for their rights in the workplace. Ever wonder why some jobs are still dominated by men? Edwardian society largely confined women to certain roles: teachers, nurses, or homemakers. Sure, progress was slow, but at least it was happening. Key takeaway? Women's entry into the workforce, while limited, marked a significant shift in societal expectations. But what good is progress without justice? The rise of trade unions marked a turning point in the Edwardian era. Long before the gig economy existed, workers united to demand better conditions. If you've ever felt powerless against a large corporation, you'll appreciate the Edwardian workers' struggle. But what good is collective bargaining if no one listens? Key takeaway? Trade unions empowered workers to fight for fair wages and improved working conditions. So, the Edwardian economy was a multifaceted engine. Think of it as a delicate ecosystem. The shift in all this economic activity shaped family life. The difference was the wealth and power were uneven. Sure, it wasn't a perfect system, but it helped grow an empire. Now that we've covered the daily grind, let's talk about what this meant for families. Key takeaway? Edwardian family structures were profoundly impacted by the demands and opportunities of the era's economy. The Edwardian era, an engine fueled by work, trade, and toil, continues to resonate with us today.
Picture, if you will, a world bathed not in the electric glow of our screens, but in the soft, flickering light of gas lamps and candlelight, an Edwardian evening. If you've ever felt the day's stresses melt away with a good movie, imagine the Edwardian families longing for similar escapes. What did they do to unwind, to find a little joy amidst the constraints of their lives? The answer, predictably, depended greatly on which side of the societal tracks they resided. For the upper classes, leisure was practically a lifestyle. Think of Downton Abbey, but with less drama and more perfectly manicured lawns. Elaborate social gatherings were the order of the day: balls, garden parties, and dinner parties that stretched late into the night,
filled with witty banter and the rustling of silk gowns. Now that we've covered that, let's talk about sporting events. They flocked to horse races like Ascot or tennis matches at Wimbledon, not just for the sport itself, but also as prime opportunities to see and be seen. Imagine the social pressure. One wrong fork at dinner and your reputation could be toast, much like burning the morning toast and setting off the smoke alarm. But what good is lavish entertainment without the resources to fund it? The wealthy have the means to travel, often venturing to the continent for extended holidays. They enjoyed the therapeutic benefits of spa towns like Bath and Harrogate. The difference was, they could actually afford it. Sure, it wasn't perfect. Imagine the endless small talk. But when your alternative was endless work, a few awkward conversations suddenly seemed a small price to pay. P takeaway. For the elite, leisure was a performance, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and status. Now, let's step down a few rungs on the social ladder. The middle class enjoyed their own versions of leisure, albeit on a smaller scale. If you've ever enjoyed a weekend getaway to a nearby seaside town, you have a taste of what the Edwardian middle class enjoyed. They might take day trips to the coast, breathing in the salty air and perhaps braving a dip in the chilly waters. Of course, their bathing suits were far more modest than today's bikinis. Imagine swimming in a wool dress. Speaking of the sea, this brings us to a popular form of entertainment, the music hall. Music halls were the equivalent of today's variety shows, a mix of singing, dancing, comedy, and perhaps even a bit of magic. Imagine a vaudeville show, but with more British reserve. Ever wonder how they found out about performances? The music hall offered a relatively affordable night out, a chance to escape the drudgery of daily life. But medieval people didn't have this luxury. The difference was, instead of watching Netflix, they were watching live entertainment. Sure, it wasn't always high art. Some acts were downright corny. But when your alternative was sitting at home staring at the wallpaper, a corny joke was a welcome distraction. Key takeaway. For the middle class, leisure was accessible and relatively affordable entertainment. Finally, let's consider the working class. For them, leisure was a precious commodity, squeezed into the few hours between long days of labor. If you've ever cherished a few quiet moments after a grueling day, you understand their desire for rest and relaxation. They found pleasure in simple things, a pint at the local pub, a game of cards with friends, or a community event like a street fair. Long before Netflix binges, community was everything. Imagine the sense of belonging. Picture this situation: a family gathering around a piano, singing songs together. Music was a common form of entertainment, often homemade rather than purchased. But what good is music without a place to gather? Church halls and community centers provided spaces for social interaction and entertainment. It was all about participation, not just passive consumption. Sure, it wasn't as glamorous as a night at the opera, but when your alternative was the grinding poverty and relentless toil, a simple sing-along felt like a true luxury. Key takeaway. For the working class, leisure was about community, connection, and finding joy in the simplest of pleasures. From grand balls to sing-alongs, Edwardian leisure was a varied landscape, shaped by social class and economic circumstance. What would you do if you were transported back to Edwardian England? Your answer probably depends on your bank account. If you've ever dreamed of a life of leisure, remember that even in the most opulent of times, true happiness often lies in the simple things: friendship, laughter, and a moment of respite from the everyday.
Shadows lengthened in the Edwardian era, didn't they? If you've ever felt a vague unease, a sense of impending change, imagine that feeling amplified across an entire society. The Edwardian period, seemingly gilded and serene, was anything but stable beneath the surface. It was like a swan gliding gracefully on a pond while paddling furiously under the water. Now that we've touched on the superficial beauty of the Edwardian era, let's talk about what was really going on. The rise of suffragism, for example, wasn't just a few ladies politely asking for the vote. It was a full-blown social earthquake. Women were chaining themselves to railings, disrupting public meetings, and generally causing a ruckus. Think of it as the Edwardian version of a viral Twitter thread, but with more hats and less meme potential. Speaking of social upheaval, this brings us to the labor movements. The working class had had enough. They were tired of long hours, low pay, and dangerous conditions. Strikes became commonplace, and socialist ideas were gaining traction. The Edwardian elite probably thought it was just a phase, like a particularly unfashionable hat, but it was a sign of deeper discontent. But what good is social unrest without a healthy dose of international tension? The threat of war was looming large. Germany was flexing its military muscles, and Britain was scrambling to keep up. Alliances were being forged, treaties were being signed, and everyone was nervously eyeing their neighbors. It was like a high-stakes game of geopolitical poker, with the fate of Europe on the table. Consider this. The Edwardian family was caught in the middle of all this. They were living their lives, going to garden parties, and worrying about their children's futures. Yet, unknowingly, they were standing on the precipice of a world war that would change everything. Imagine planning a picnic while a hurricane is brewing just offshore. That's kind of what it must have felt like. This period wasn't just about grand political movements and international conflicts. It was woven into the fabric of everyday lives. Discussions about women's suffrage might have taken place at the breakfast table alongside the usual chatter about the weather or the latest society gossip. The father of the family might be a factory owner dealing with striking workers, and this stress would inevitably affect the atmosphere at home. Now we're seeing Edwardian society from the perspective of the families that lived in it.
let's look at how the looming threat of war affected day-to-day decisions. Families might have been more inclined to save money, unsure of what the future held. Young men might have felt a sense of duty to enlist in the military, while their mothers and sisters worried about their safety. In every household, a sense of uncertainty was growing. You know how people say that history is written by the victors? Well, it's also written by the survivors. The Edwardian era may be remembered for its elegance and grandeur, but it's important to remember the shadows that lurked beneath the surface. It was a time of great change, great tension, and great uncertainty. It was a world on the brink. Even the most beautiful waltz must end. Key takeaway: the Edwardian era was a period of hidden anxieties, where families unknowingly stood on the edge of irreversible change. And as our journey through this era concludes, I hope you found a measure of peace in understanding the past. Remember, even in times of unrest, life finds a way, as did those Edwardian families.